Evil mom took away dad's parental rights. Girl shocks entire courtroom when she shows. 3 years ago, a mother successfully convinced the court to revoke a father's parental rights through carefully orchestrated lies and manipulation. When the father finally secured a chance to have his case reheard, the mother strode into the courtroom, brimming with confidence and certain her facade would hold. But when the young girl took the stand, her shocking revelation left the entire courtroom in stunned silence. Comment below where you're watching from today, and if you enjoy these stories, don't forget to subscribe. The marble steps of the courthouse loomed large as 12-year-old Julia Carter arrived with her mother, Karen Blake. The crisp air carried a tense energy that matched the knot twisting in Julia's stomach. Her small frame seemed to disappear into her oversized, fashionable clothes as she trailed behind her mother, who walked briskly ahead. Karen's high heels echoed sharply against the pavement, each click punctuating the silence between them. Julia's wide, anxious eyes darted nervously around, taking in the courthouse's imposing stone facade, a reminder of the day's serious undertones. As they approached the entrance, a man in a crisp suit stepped forward to greet them. "Good morning, Miss Blake." "Julia," he said, his voice calm and measured. "I'm Thomas Hale, your lawyer." Karen gave a curt nod, her glamorous appearance clashing with Thomas's polished professionalism. "Let's get this over with," she muttered, ushering Julia ahead. The three joined the line for the security check, moving slowly as people passed through metal detectors. Leaning close to Karen, Thomas spoke in a hushed tone, "Remember the plan. It's crucial we stick to the narrative that Julia's condition is linked to her leukemia progression, not neglect." Karen drummed her fingers impatiently against her designer purse. Yes, I know," she hissed. "We've gone over this 100 times." At the checkpoint, Karen placed her bag on the conveyor belt. The security officer's eyes narrowed at the X-ray screen. "Ma'am, I'll need to check your bag," he said firmly. Karen's face flushed as the officer retrieved a small flask. "I'm sorry, but you can't bring this into the courthouse," he stated, confiscating the item. Thomas's jaw tightened, though he stayed silent. Once through the scanner, he pulled Karen aside, his voice low but sharp. "What were you thinking bringing alcohol here?" Karen's eyes flashed defensively. "I just forgot it was in there," she snapped. Pinching the bridge of his nose, Thomas exhaled slowly. "And your outfit? We talked about this. The flashy clothes, the luxury bag, it doesn't give off the image of a modest, dedicated mother we're trying to portray." Karen lifted her chin defiantly. "I'm not dressing modestly today. My husband is rich, and dressing poor won't help us win." Thomas shook his head, frustration evident. "It's not about wealth. It's about creating the right impression for Judge William Hardy. He's meticulous and sharp. We can't afford to slip up." Karen rolled her eyes but turned to Julia, her tone sharp. "Did you hear what Mr. Thomas just said? Be a good girl, stay quiet, and leave all the talking to the adult. Don't try anything funny." "Yes, Mother," Julia replied softly, her practiced obedience evident. Karen demanded, "Repeat it." Julia whispered, "Stay quiet. Let the adults talk. Say we've complied with all treatment." As Karen resumed her discussion with Thomas, Julia's attention wandered. The bustling hallway was filled with stern-faced lawyers and anxious clients. Suddenly, her gaze landed on a familiar figure across the hall, her father, Jonathan Carter. Dressed neatly in a suit, his hair combed and face freshly shaven, Jonathan looked prepared and composed. He was deep in conversation with a woman Julia assumed to be his lawyer, but as if sensing her eyes on him, he glanced her way. Their gazes locked and the world seemed to pause. Julia's face brightened, her anxiety momentarily forgotten. She raised her hand in a small wave, and Jonathan's expression softened as he returned it. For a moment, he paused mid-sentence, captivated by the sight of his daughter. Karen and Thomas were engrossed in their strategy discussion, their voices blending into the background. Julia seized the moment, her small frame slipping unnoticed through the crowd of adults. Her pulse quickened with every step toward her father, the courthouse noise fading as she closed the gap. Jonathan's smile widened as Julia approached. Opening his arms, he welcomed her into a warm embrace. "I've missed you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I've missed you too, sweetheart," Jonathan murmured, stroking her back gently. Pulling back slightly, he studied her face. "Your wig looks lovely, you're a little princess today," he said softly, acknowledging the accessory she wore to cover the effects of chemotherapy. Julia blushed and mumbled a shy, "Thank you." "How have you been?" Jonathan asked gently, concern tinging his voice. "Any updates on your treatment?" Julia hesitated. "The chemo's still going, but I've been really sick these past few months. I've missed a lot of school." Her voice dropped. "Mom gets mad when I don't go." Jonathan's brow furrowed. "And how's your medicine? Are you taking it regularly?" Shifting uncomfortably, Julia avoided his eyes. "Sometimes Mom forgets or the cabinet's locked. I can't always get to it." Jonathan's lawyer discreetly noted her words. Jonathan, his expression troubled, decided to lighten the mood. "Hey, remember swimming at my place last time? You loved it?" Julia's face lit up. "Oh yes. Can I come again soon?" "I hope so," Jonathan replied warmly. "After today, we might get to spend more time together. It sometimes forgot to feed the baby bird." Julia's brow furrowed as she listened closely. The other parent bird, Jonathan continued, was more focused on ensuring the chick was happy and healthy. It worked hard to find the best worms and seeds for the baby. "What happened to the baby bird?" Julia asked, her voice small. Jonathan's tone softened. "Well, one day an old owl, think of it as a kind of judge for birds, came to the nest. The owl noticed the baby bird wasn't as healthy as it should be, so it had to decide which parent bird would take better care of the chick." Julia's eyes widened with understanding. Is that what's happening today?" Jonathan nodded gently. "Something like that, yes. The judge, our owl, is going to listen to both sides and decide what's best for you." For a moment, Julia's face showed sadness, but Jonathan managed to draw a small giggle from her with a silly bird impression. The laughter faded quickly, though, as she glanced back toward her mother. "Dad," she said hesitantly, "Mom says you're always working, that you won't have time for me." Jonathan knelt to meet Julia's gaze, his expression serious. "Julia, listen to me. No matter what happens, you will always be my top priority. Yes, I work hard, but I promise you, I will always make time for you. We'll figure it out together, okay?" Julia nodded, a small smile returning to her face. As they talked quietly, neither noticed Karen finally realizing Julia was missing and starting to scan the crowded hallway. Karen's conversation with Thomas was cut short when he suddenly pointed across the hall, his eyes widening. "Miss Blake, where's your daughter?" he asked urgently. "Julia's not here." Karen whirled around, frantically scanning the crowd until her eyes landed on Julia and Jonathan. Her face darkened instantly, a storm of emotions flashing, anger, fear, and something that looked almost like jealousy. "Karen, wait," Thomas began, but she was already moving, storming across the hall with determined strides. Thomas followed closely behind, trying to maintain professional composure even as Karen's tension radiated. Spotting her mother's approach, Julia instinctively shrank back, stepping closer to Jonathan. The warmth she had felt moments ago evaporated, replaced by a familiar sense of anxiety. Karen reached them in seconds, yanking Julia's arm and pulling her away from Jonathan. "Stay away from her," she snarled, her voice low but full of venom. "Or have you forgotten the restraining order?" "Mom, it's okay," Julia protested weakly, her voice barely audible. "Dad was nice to me. We were just talking." "Be quiet," Karen snapped, silencing Julia with a harsh glare. Jonathan held his ground, his posture tense but controlled, as Karen berated him. Then, he caught a familiar scent on her breath. His eyes narrowed slightly. "Tade?" he asked quietly, his tone calm but probing. "Have you been drinking again, Karen?" The question hit her like a blow. Karen recoiled slightly before her anger reignited. "How dare you?" she hissed. You're making up lies to ruin my reputation. I haven't touched a drop. Jonathan kept his voice even. I'm just saying what I observe. If it's not true, there's no need to be defensive. Karen's face contorted with rage. Without warning, she shoved his shoulder. You bastard, she spat. You think you can just waltz in here and… Mom, stop? Julia cried, trying to step between them. But Karen, blinded by her anger, roughly pushed Julia aside. The girl stumbled and fell to the floor. In an instant, Jonathan's lawyer was at her side. Are you okay? She asked gently, offering her hand. I'm Rebecca Green, your father's attorney. Julia nodded mutely, taking Rebecca's hand and standing. Thomas struggled to restrain Karen, whose shouting was now drawing attention from those nearby. You stay away from my daughter! Karen yelled, her composure completely shattered. You lost your rights. You have no business being near her. Court security quickly intervened, creating a buffer between the two parents. Karen threw one final reminder, her voice echoing through the hallway. He has a restraining order. He's not allowed near Julia. Jonathan straightened his suit, his voice firm but calm. Let's see about that today, Karen. See you inside. They were well prepared. Judge Hardy nodded and said, For the record, let's establish some context. Mr. Jonathan Carter and Ms. Karen Blake divorced 3 years ago, with Ms. Blake being granted full custody of their daughter, Julia. Mr. Carter's visitation rights were significantly limited due to allegations of abuse and emotional instability. Is this correct? Yes, Your Honor, Rebecca confirmed. And now Mr. Carter is petitioning the court to reopen the custody case and revoke Ms. Blake's parental rights based on new evidence. Is that correct? That's correct, Your Honor, Rebecca stated. We have uncovered substantial evidence of neglect regarding Julia's cancer treatment and misuse of child support funds. Additionally, Mr. Carter's observations during limited supervised visits have revealed signs of neglect, including frequent unexplained illnesses and injuries. Judge Hardy nodded, his expression neutral. I see. And Ms. Blake denies these allegations? Absolutely, Your Honor, Thomas interjected. We maintain that Julia's health issues are a result of her ongoing battle with leukemia, not neglect. Very well, Judge Hardy said. We'll hear all the evidence in due course. Let's begin with opening statements. Ms. Green, as the petitioner, you may proceed. Rebecca stood, her posture confident, and addressed the court. Your Honor, this case is about more than custody. It's about the safety, well-being, and future of a child who has been neglected and emotionally harmed by her custodial parent. We will prove that Ms. Karen Blake deliberately misused child support funds intended for Julia's care, engaged in abusive behavior, and manipulated previous court proceedings to unjustly strip Mr. Jonathan Carter of his parental right. Today, we seek to rectify this grave injustice and ensure Julia's future is placed in safe hands. As Rebecca spoke, Julia's eyes widened, her gaze flicking between her mother's increasingly tense posture and her father's steady presence. Judge Hardy turned to Thomas. Mr. Hale, your opening statement. Thomas rose, straightening his tie. Your Honor, Ms. Karen Blake has always acted in Julia's best interest. Mr. Carter's accusations are baseless and an attempt to regain control over a family dynamic that has already been resolved in this court. We will demonstrate that Julia's health challenges are a result of her ongoing battle with leukemia, not neglect. Ms. Blake has been a devoted mother, navigating the difficulties of single parenthood while caring for a seriously ill child. Mr. Carter's petition is nothing more than an attempt to use his financial advantage to malign Ms. Blake and disrupt the stability Julia has under her mother's care. As Thomas spoke, Karen nodded emphatically, while Jonathan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Julia, caught between them, seemed to shrink further into her seat. Judge Hardy's expression remained impassive as he absorbed both perspectives, though his eyes occasionally drifted to Julia's small figure at the table. Thank you, counselors, he said as Thomas concluded. We'll now proceed with the presentation of evidence. Ms. Green, you may call your first witness. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as Rebecca stood once more, ready to present their case. Julia's hands twisted nervously in her lap, her young mind struggling to comprehend the gravity of the proceedings that would determine her future. Rebecca Green stood confidently before the court, her voice clear and steady. "Your Honor, I'd like to call our first witness, Mr. Daniel Forrester, a certified forensic accountant." As Mr. Forrester took the stand and was sworn in, Julia noticed her mother's posture stiffen, her knuckles whitening as she gripped the edge of the table. "Mr. Forrester," Rebecca began, "could you please explain to the court what you found when examining the financial records related to Julia Carter's care?" The accountant nodded, his demeanor professional and detached. "Certainly. Upon thorough examination of bank statements, credit card records, and other financial documents obtained through subpoena, I discovered a disturbing pattern of misuse regarding the child support funds provided by Mr. Carter." He proceeded to present a series of spreadsheets and bank statements on a large screen visible to the entire court. "As you can see here," he pointed, "thousands of dollars meant for Julia's care were instead diverted to Ms. Blake's personal expenses. These include luxury clothing purchases, high-end alcohol, and several vacations, none of which included Julia." Karen's face flushed red as the evidence was presented, her lawyer leaning in to whisper urgently in her ear. "Furthermore," Mr. Forrester continued, "I found numerous instances where Julia's medical bills were paid late or by third parties, despite Mr. Carter providing ample funds for her care." As the financial evidence mounted, Julia sank lower in her seat, her eyes darting nervously between her parents. Jonathan's face remained stoic, but his eyes reflected a mix of anger and sadness as he listened to the details of how the money meant for his daughter's care had been misused. After the accountant's testimony, Rebecca called Julia's court-appointed advocate to the stand. The advocate, a kind-faced woman named Maria Thompson, took her seat, her eyes briefly meeting Julia's with a reassuring smile. "Ms. Thompson," Rebecca began, "could you please share with the court your findings from your interviews with Julia?" Maria's voice was gentle but firm as she spoke. "In my conversations with Julia, several concerning patterns emerged. She described being left alone at home for extended periods, often missing meals. Julia also exhibited fearful behavior when discussing her mother's mood swings, particularly after Karen had been drinking." At this, Karen made a small noise of protest, quickly silenced by Thomas's warning glance. Maria continued, her voice growing strained. "What troubled me most were Julia's descriptions of violent outbursts. In one instance, she told me about being given a timeout where she was locked in a room an entire day without food after accidentally spilling milk. This occurred while her mother was drinking at the dining table. "You've been drinking again. I can smell it," Julia said, her voice trembling. But before she could say more, Karen's hand lashed out, striking her cheek and leaving an angry red mark. "Listen to me," Karen hissed, her tone low and menacing. "What you said to your advocate was bad enough. If you pull anything funny in that courtroom, I'll make sure you never see either of us again." Karen handed Julia a powder compact. "Now wash your face, cover that mark, and fix that sad look. We're going back in." Julia, obediently washing her face in the restroom, heard her mother's threat echoing in her mind. As she caught her reflection in the mirror, the girl staring back at her looked lost and afraid, a far cry from the happy child she used to be. Her hands trembled as she applied the powder, trying her best to hide the red welt on her cheek. Outside the restroom, the corridor buzzed with tension as the parties prepared to re-enter the courtroom. Julia followed her mother, her steps heavy and weighed down by secrets and fears. Back in the courtroom, Julia's eyes met her father's across the room. He was already seated and gave her a discreet sign in their special sign language. "I love you, my girl." A faint, fleeting smile touched her lips as she remembered the nights he had spent teaching her to communicate with her deaf best friend. It was a small gesture, but it warmed her heart just enough to push forward. When Judge Hardy returned to the bench, his eyes softened as he addressed Julia directly. "Julia," he said, his tone both firm and gentle, I'd like to hear from you now. I know this might feel scary, but this courtroom is a safe space for you to share the truth. Can you tell us about your life at home?" Julia hesitated, glancing nervously between her mother's stern expression and her father's encouraging nod. She felt the throbbing pain on her cheek, only partially concealed by makeup. Her mother's threats from earlier whispered in her mind, battling her father's silent promises of safety. "It's okay, Julia," Judge Hardy reassured her. "Take your time. And remember, if anyone has made threats to keep you from speaking the truth, you can tell me about that too." Her gaze dropped to her lap as her hands twisted anxiously. She thought about her mother's harsh words, about how her father wouldn't have time for her. But then she remembered his warmth, his gentleness, and the way he had always made time for her, before the divorce. Julia glanced up and met her father's eyes. He gave her a soft smile, blinking in that gentle way she knew, silently encouraging her. With trembling hands, she made her decision. Reaching up, she began to remove her wig. The courtroom fell silent, all eyes fixed on her as she slowly revealed her bald head. Audible gasps rippled through the room. Bruises and partially healed wounds were now visible. Across the courtroom, Jonathan half rose from his seat, a strangled sound escaping his throat. Rebecca placed a steady hand on his arm, urging him to stay calm. Through her tears, Julia began to speak, her voice small but growing stronger with each word. "Mom drinks a lot," she said, her eyes fixed on the judge. "When she's drunk, she gets angry. She hits me, with her hands, or with things like shoes or the TV remote." Karen abruptly stood. "She's lying," she shouted. "Those marks are from a fight at school." Judge Hardy banged his gavel sharply. "Miss Blake, sit down immediately." "Julia, please continue." Julia nodded, her voice gaining strength. "Mom forgets my medicine. The cabinet is locked, so I can't get to it. She doesn't take me to therapy anymore. The house is dirty, and I get sick a lot after my chemotherapy. She doesn't help me clean my wounds, and sometimes they get infected." Her voice faltered as she added, "She says I'm ugly because of how I look after chemo. She says the wig is the only thing that makes me not embarrassing to be seen with." The courtroom was deathly silent as Julia's words hung in the air. Her father's face was etched with anguish, while Karen sat frozen, her expression flickering between fury and fear. Tears streaming down her face, Julia looked directly at the judge. "Your Honor," she said, barely above a whisper, "I'm scared to go home with my mom. She hurts me. She even hit me in the restroom earlier during the recess. Please, please let me live with my dad. We must remember that raising a child with a serious illness like leukemia is an enormous challenge. Ms. Blake has been Julia's primary caregiver throughout her illness, navigating the complexities of her medical care while also managing the household." He paused, seeming to search for words. "We acknowledge that there have been lapses in judgment, but these should be viewed in the context of the immense stress Ms. Blake has been under. We ask the court to consider mandated counseling and support services rather than a change in custody, which would be yet another upheaval in Julia's life." As Thomas spoke, Karen's agitation grew visibly. She fidgeted in her seat, her eyes darting around the courtroom. When Thomas concluded his argument, she suddenly stood up. "This is all lies," she shouted, her voice shrill. "Julia is mine. Jonathan can't have her." Judge Hardy's gavel came down hard. "Ms. Blake, sit down immediately, or you will be removed from this courtroom." Karen sank back into her seat, her body trembling with barely contained rage. Julia, watching from her seat, seemed to shrink even further, her eyes wide with fear. Judge Hardy's expression was grave as he addressed the court. "In light of the extensive evidence presented today, I will be taking a short recess to consider my verdict. We will reconvene in 30 minutes. As the judge left the bench, the courtroom buzzed with tense whispers. Jonathan conferred quietly with Rebecca, while Karen argued with Thomas in harsh, angry whispers. Julia sat alone with her advocate, clutching her wig and stealing glances at her father. The 30-minute recess felt like an eternity to all involved. When Judge Hardy finally returned to the bench, The courtroom fell into a hushed silence, all eyes fixed on him as he prepared to deliver his verdict. After careful consideration of all the evidence presented today, I am ready to deliver my verdict, Judge Hardy began, his voice carrying clear authority. This case has revealed a deeply troubling situation, one that demands immediate action for the safety and well-being of the child involved. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the courtroom before continuing. First, I want to address the evidence of Ms. Blake's persistent abuse and neglect. The financial records clearly show a pattern of misusing funds intended for Julia's care. The medical evidence, coupled with Julia's own testimony, paints a disturbing picture of physical abuse and medical neglect that has put Julia's health and life at risk. Karen's face paled as the judge spoke, while Jonathan leaned forward, his expression a mix of hope and concern. Furthermore, Judge Hardy continued, the evidence of manipulation in previous custody hearings is extremely serious. The false testimony and altered documents presented 3 years ago led to a gross miscarriage of justice, unjustly stripping Mr. Carter of his parental rights. The judge's voice grew stern as he addressed Karen directly. Ms. Blake, your actions have not only endangered your daughter's physical health, but have caused deep emotional trauma. Your behavior in this courtroom today has only reinforced the concerns about your ability to provide a stable, nurturing environment for Julia. Karen seemed to deflate under the judge's words, her earlier defiance crumbling into a look of despair. Judge Hardy then turned his attention to Jonathan. Mr. Carter, while you were wrongly deprived of your parental rights, you have demonstrated a commitment to Julia's well-being by initiating this investigation and seeking to rectify the situation. Taking a deep breath, Judge Hardy delivered his ruling. In light of all the evidence presented, I hereby order the immediate transfer of full custody of Julia Carter to her father, Jonathan Carter. A collective gasp went through the courtroom. Julia's eyes widened, her gaze darting between her parents. The judge continued. Ms. Blake, you are hereby ordered to undergo a comprehensive psychological evaluation. You will also be required to enter an alcohol rehabilitation program. Until these programs are completed and a thorough review is conducted, your visitation rights will be restricted to supervised visits only. Karen let out a strangled cry, but Judge Hardy pressed on. I am also appointing a guardian ad litem to oversee Julia's transition and ensure her ongoing care and safety. This guardian will work closely with Mr. Carter and Julia's medical team to ensure all her needs are met. Judge Hardy's voice softened slightly as he addressed Julia directly. Julia, I know this has been a difficult and scary process for you, but I want you to know that your bravery in speaking up today has helped ensure your safety and well-being moving forward. As the judge concluded his ruling, the courtroom erupted into a flurry of activity. Court officers moved to take Karen into custody on charges of child abuse, neglect, and financial exploitation. She struggled briefly, making one last attempt to reach Julia. You can't do this! Karen screamed, her voice raw with emotion. She's my daughter! Julia's advocate quickly moved to shield her from Karen's outburst. Jonathan, with tears in his eyes, approached Julia cautiously, kneeling down to her eye level. It's over, sweetheart, he said softly, opening his arms. You're safe now. Julia hesitated for just a moment before rushing into her father's embrace. They clung to each other, both crying quietly as the courtroom slowly emptied around them. It was a moment of profound relief, and the beginning of a long journey of healing for both father and daughter. As the initial shock of the verdict began to subside, the courtroom buzzed with activity. Jonathan, still holding Julia close, began to move through the room, expressing his gratitude to those who had helped uncover the truth and bring justice for his daughter. He approached Rebecca first, shaking her hand warmly. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Your thorough investigation and unwavering support made all the difference." Rebecca smiled, her professional demeanor softening slightly. "It was my honor to help, Mr. Carter. Julia's bravery made our job much easier." Next, Jonathan turned to the private investigator, school officials, and medical professionals who had testified. Each received personal thanks for their courage in coming forward. The child psychologist who had testified about Julia's trauma approached, offering her card. "Julia will need ongoing support to process everything she's been through," she explained gently. "Please don't